Sometimes Jesus disappeared, not to perform miracles, not to preach, not even to teach. He quietly walked away, up into the hills, alone with the silence, away from the crowds and into the stillness of the mountains. In this quiet space, let's reflect on what those moments might have meant, not just for him, but for us. He was surrounded by people almost all the time. Some came to be healed, some came to accuse, others followed him without even knowing why. They pressed in, desperate for a miracle, a sign, a word, and still, in the middle of it all, Jesus would quietly slip away. No announcement, no dramatic exit, just gone. They would wake up in the morning and ask, "Where is he?" And someone might point toward the hills. He went up there again, alone. This wasn't a one-time event. It was a rhythm, almost a pattern. When the world pressed in, he pressed out. When the crowds grew louder, he grew quieter. He withdrew not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. He didn't run away from responsibility. He walked toward restoration. And in those mountains, in the stillness, far from the noise, something sacred happened. Not performance, not productivity, just presence. We often imagine strength as doing more. But Jesus showed us that true strength sometimes means doing less. True power can look like stepping away. True leadership can mean disappearing, so you can return renewed. He didn't need the applause. He didn't crave attention. He knew that to carry light into the world, he first had to be lit by the flame of solitude. The mountain wasn't an escape. It was a return to the Father, a return to peace, a return to being before doing. And maybe, just maybe, we're allowed to do the same. Maybe the world doesn't fall apart if we rest. Maybe the sacred is found not in striving, but in stillness. Maybe holiness isn't loud. Maybe it sounds like a quiet breeze through the trees, somewhere high above the noise, where even Jesus chose to disappear. The morning was still dark. No birds yet, no footsteps, no sound. And Jesus was already gone. Before anyone else awoke, before the fires were relit, before the disciples rubbed the sleep from their eyes, he had already risen, not to teach, not to travel, but to retreat. He didn't sleep in, he didn't delay. He moved quietly, gently, out of the village and toward the hills. The early morning mist clung to the air. Dew shimmered on the grass. The stars hadn't yet faded, and the sun was only beginning to whisper its approach. That was the hour he loved. Not because it was efficient, not because it was impressive, but because it was empty. Empty of noise, empty of people, empty of distraction. This was his sanctuary. No temple walls, no golden lampstands, no curtains dividing holy from ordinary. Just mountains, just sky, just the sound of his breath in the stillness. He found something there that couldn't be found in crowds. A deeper voice, a clearer presence, an invisible intimacy with the Father, quiet, gentle, and real. And maybe that's what prayer really is. Not saying more, not asking for things, but simply showing up before the sun and being there, listening, waiting, receiving. We imagine prayer as something loud, dramatic, spiritual. But Jesus showed us it could be the opposite. It could be silent. It could be simple. It could be the first thing you do before the world even knows you're awake. Imagine him sitting there, the dust on his robe, the cool earth beneath him, his eyes slowly closing in reverent peace. Nothing flashy, nothing urgent, just this, quiet connection. And as the sky began to brighten and the birds began to sing, he remained there, unhurried. The world would soon come looking for him, the sick, the broken, the doubters. But for now, there was only this, the hush of early morning and the heartbeat of God. We often think we need to start our day strong, with plans and goals. But Jesus started his day slow, with prayer and presence. And maybe, just maybe, that's why he never seemed in a rush. That's why he always knew where to go. That's why he could love the unlovable, touch the untouchable, and forgive the unforgivable. Because before anything else, he had already met with the Father, alone in the early morning stillness, in the mountains. The crowds were growing. Word had spread. In every town, every village, every dusty road, people were whispering his name. The healer. The teacher. The one who speaks like no one else. They brought their sick, their blind, their desperate. They came with hope, with curiosity, with broken hearts and shattered dreams. And Jesus welcomed them. He touched their wounds. He looked into their eyes. He spoke truth, not with volume, but with weight. But after the miracles, after the stories, after the long days filled with faces and hands and noise, he disappeared. Not into a home, not behind a curtain, but up into the mountains once again. Why? Because people are heavy. Even love is heavy. When you carry others day after day, moment after moment, something in your soul needs space. Something in your spirit needs to breathe. The pressure of the crowd was real. Some wanted healing. Others wanted to trap him with words. A few just wanted to see something spectacular. Not everyone came for truth. Some came for entertainment. Others came with expectations. To make him king. To make him fight. To make him fit into their box. And Jesus, knowing all of this, stepped away. He didn't argue. He didn't scold. He simply walked toward the mountain, again, because peace cannot be found in a crowd, because clarity is rarely born from noise, because sometimes, in order to remember who you are, you must leave behind what everyone else wants you to be. The mountains didn't ask anything of him. The trees didn't want miracles. The rocks didn't demand proof. The silence didn't twist his words. There he could rest. There he could speak to the Father with no interruptions, no performances, no distractions. There was no schedule, no ministry, no followers, just space and silence. We live in a world that pushes us to stay on, to keep performing, to keep posting, to keep showing up, even when our souls are quietly crumbling. But Jesus reminds us that it's okay to leave. It's okay to withdraw. It's okay to say, not now. I need the mountain. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't avoiding. He was preparing. Because even Jesus needed to recharge. He wasn't running from the mission. He was running to the source. He wasn't afraid of the people. He just knew that love without rest turns into burnout. That compassion without solitude turns into resentment. That presence without prayer turns into performance. So he stepped away, not out of fear, but out of faith. He trusted that the work could wait. He trusted that the world could pause. He trusted that nothing was more important than communion with the Father. And maybe if Jesus, the Son of God, the Savior of the world, needed to step away from the pressure of the crowd, then maybe so do we. Maybe we're allowed to take a breath, to turn off the noise, to disappear for a while, not to abandon the world, but to return to it more full, more whole, more anchored in love. Because even the brightest light needs oil to keep burning. And the oil is found in the quiet places, on the lonely hills, far from the noise, where Jesus went, again and again, to be filled, to be held, to remember who he really was. So when the pressure rises in your life, when everyone wants something from you, when it feels like the world is too loud. Remember the mountain. Remember the silence. Remember him. There's something quietly radical about the way Jesus prayed. He didn't stand on corners with lifted hands to be seen. He didn't wear special robes or use lofty language. His prayers weren't loud. They weren't rehearsed. They weren't designed to impress anyone, because there was no one there to impress. He simply withdrew. Alone, sometimes for hours, sometimes all night. And when he prayed, there was no audience, no crowd, no applause, just a conversation, just a presence, just a father and a son. That was enough. In a world obsessed with performance, this is a quiet kind of rebellion, to pray without needing anyone else to see it, to speak not to be heard by others, but to be heard by the one who sees in secret, to pray without trying to be spiritual, without needing to be wise, without needing to be right, just real, just honest, just there. This kind of prayer doesn't sell. It doesn't draw attention. It doesn't go viral. It doesn't make you famous, but it makes you whole. Jesus didn't teach prayer like a technique. He lived it like a rhythm. It wasn't about results. It was about relationship. It wasn't about words. It was about awareness. Being with the Father was the goal, not getting something from him. No requests, no bargains, no manipulation, just stillness, just being, just love. And maybe that's why he was never shaken, because he didn't pray occasionally. He prayed constantly. He didn't fit God into his day. He let his day flow from God. Every decision, every miracle, every word, it came from this well of quiet, hidden prayer. This is the kind of prayer we often overlook. We prefer noise. We prefer structure. We prefer control. But Jesus shows us something deeper, something quieter, a way of praying that doesn't begin with speaking, but with listening, a kind of stillness that allows your soul to be seen, even when you have no words. He told his followers to go into their room and close the door, not because the room is magic, not because the door is holy, but because something happens when you shut everything else out, when you stop pretending, when you stop performing, when you stop trying to sound religious. And that's where the real prayer begins, not on your lips, but in your silence, not with fancy language, but with honest presence. The kind of prayer Jesus lived was not built for show, it was built for survival, because life is heavy, people are complicated, the mission is exhausting, and love, real love, costs something. So he prayed, not to escape life, but to face it, not to get away from people, but to return to them with peace. He didn't need a perfect environment. He didn't need candles or choirs or a carefully written script. The mountain was enough. The garden was enough. The wilderness was enough. The Father was enough. And in that quiet place, something happened that the world never saw. His strength was restored. His heart was steadied. His purpose was renewed. Prayer without performance isn't glamorous. It won't get you recognition. It won't make people admire you. But it will change you. It will ground you. It will strip away the noise.
It will remind you that you're not God, and you don't have to be.
Because he is. And he is listening. So when you feel empty, worn out, unseen, you don't have to try harder. You don't have to impress him. You just have to be still and let your soul be seen. That's what Jesus did. That's what he showed us. That prayer, real prayer, can be as quiet as a breath and as deep as eternity. Even Jesus grew tired. He walked for miles, spoke for hours, faced endless questions, opposition, demands. He touched lepers. He wept with grieving families. He fed the hungry, calmed storms, cast out demons. He bore the weight of the brokenness around him, day after day after day. And sometimes He just needed to rest. This truth is so simple we often miss it. We forget that the Son of God had a body, and that body grew weary. We forget that his muscles ached, that his eyes got heavy, that his voice wore out, that his heart felt the deep fatigue of loving a world that so often refused to love back. He wasn't a machine. He wasn't powered by performance. He was human, fully divine, yes, but fully human. And in his humanity, he needed rest. Not because he was weak, but because he honored the rhythm of being alive. He slept in boats while storms raged. He withdrew after miracles. He disappeared after feeding thousands. He often told people no, not out of rejection, but out of necessity, because even he had limits, and he never apologized for honoring them. There's something profoundly holy about that. We live in a world that rewards exhaustion, that praises the grind, that teaches us to pour out until we're empty, and then to keep going anyway. But Jesus shows us something different. He shows us that rest is not a reward. It's a requirement. It's not what you do when the work is done. It's what you do so the work can even begin. He wasn't lazy. He was intentional. He didn't escape. He retreated. He didn't withdraw from people because he stopped loving them. He withdrew because he loved them enough to come back whole. Think about that. Jesus didn't just rest for himself. He rested for us. Because tired love grows bitter. Tired compassion becomes cold. Tired truth can start to sound hollow. So he went to the mountains, or the desert, or a quiet place. Anywhere away from the noise, the demands, the relentless pull of more. And in that silence, he breathed. He prayed. He waited. He listened. He let his soul return to center. If the Savior of the world needed space to be still, then maybe you do too. Maybe you're not lazy. Maybe you're just tired. Maybe you're not unspiritual. Maybe your soul is asking for a quiet place. Maybe you don't need more discipline. Maybe you need more grace. Jesus never taught his disciples to hustle. He never told them to work until they collapsed. In fact, when they came back from doing ministry, healing, preaching, traveling, the first thing he said was, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." Mark 6:31. He didn't say, "Let's do more." He said, "Let's pause." He didn't say, "Be stronger." He said, "Come away." Because he knew burned out people can't change the world. Empty vessels can't pour out love. Tired hearts lose sight of heaven. So he rested. Not after everything was perfect, but right in the middle of the chaos. Right when the crowd still had needs. Right when the work wasn't done. Right when the disciples were still learning. He chose rest anyway. And in that choice, he taught us something we desperately need to remember. That it's okay to slow down. That it's okay to be human. That God does not demand our exhaustion. He invites our rest. So tonight, if your body feels heavy, if your mind is tired, if your spirit feels distant and dim, remember, even Jesus needed rest. You are allowed to pause. You are allowed to breathe. You are allowed to walk away for a moment, not to give up, but to be filled again. He did, and if it was enough for him, it is enough for you. There are moments in Scripture that pass by quietly, almost like a whisper. You read them once, and they don't demand attention. But if you pause, if you listen closely, they begin to echo with something deeper. One of those moments is this. He went out to the mountain to pray, and he continued all night in prayer to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them. Luke 6:12-13. It seems simple. Jesus prayed, then chose his disciples. But buried in that moment is something sacred, a glimpse into the deep stillness where divine decisions are made. Before selecting the 12 who would carry his message into the world, before placing his trust in men who would fail, betray, deny, and doubt. Jesus didn't brainstorm. He didn't analyze personalities. He didn't consult experts or hold interviews. He went to the mountain, alone, in the dark, while everyone else slept. And he stayed there all night. Not to escape responsibility, but to prepare for it. Not to avoid the decision, but to align his heart with the Father's. Because some choices are too holy to be rushed. Some moments are too sacred to be handled casually. When you look at his life, you'll see it again and again. The pattern of disappearing before doing something that would change everything. The mountaintop was not a delay. It was where the clarity came from. We don't know what was spoken in that night of prayer. We don't know what Jesus heard. We don't know how long he sat in silence before any answer came. But we do know this: he never made big decisions disconnected from the stillness of God. The mountain was his place of clarity, away from the demands, away from the urgency, away from the noise that tries to pressure you into choosing quickly. He went where the air was thin, where the distractions fell away, where the only voice that mattered could be heard without distortion. And there, he waited. Can you imagine it? The stars above, the wind moving softly through the trees, the hush of the world asleep. Jesus kneeling on the cold earth, listening. Not for approval, but for direction. He didn't fear the decision. He revered it, because he knew the weight of what was coming. He knew that these 12 would walk with him, misunderstand him, and eventually be the ones to carry his light after he was gone. And so, he didn't rush. He gave the moment the space it deserved. How often do we do the opposite? We make life-changing choices while tired, distracted, overstimulated, and pressured. We choose out of fear or out of urgency or because we feel we have no time to think. But Jesus shows us another way. That wisdom begins with withdrawal. That clarity often arrives in silence. That some answers come only when we're willing to pause long enough to hear them. The world is loud, and decisions come quickly. But not everything holy can be done in a hurry. Jesus knew this. So he went to the mountain, and when the sun rose, when the world stirred awake, when the disciples gathered again, he came down from the silence with a decision that would shape the rest of history. Not because he guessed, not because he acted on impulse, but because he had first been still. Stillness doesn't mean indecision. It means reverence. It means choosing not to act until you've remembered what voice really matters. The mountain wasn't just a place of rest. It was a place of clarity. And maybe that's what we need more than anything. Not more opinions, not more urgency, but a mountain of our own. A space where we can sit quietly with God, long enough to remember who we are and where we're going. Because in the stillness, in the quiet, clarity comes. In a world where noise is constant and distraction is the norm, silence can feel uncomfortable, even threatening. We're conditioned to fill every gap with sound, every pause with movement, every moment of quiet with something, anything, to avoid feeling still. But Jesus wasn't afraid of silence. He didn't rush to fill it. He didn't escape it. He walked into it and stayed there. Again and again, he withdrew into lonely places. He left the noise, the questions, the admiration, and the pressure behind. And he entered into silence, not as a last resort, but as a sacred return. There, in the quiet, he didn't lose his strength. He found it. Because silence wasn't emptiness to him, it was intimacy. It wasn't a void. It was a sanctuary. It was the only place where the world's voices faded, and the voice of the Father rose. And that is where his strength was born, not in the miracle, not in the moment of action, but in the invisible hours of stillness when no one was watching. There's something deeply misunderstood about strength. We often mistake noise for power. We think shouting makes us heard, that moving faster makes us effective, that having more opinions makes us wise. But Jesus shows us something different. When he stood before governors and priests, he was often silent. When he was accused, he didn't defend himself. When the crowds pushed in, he withdrew. His silence was not weakness. It was control. It was confidence. It was authority rooted in something deeper than the moment. Because silence is not absence, it is presence without anxiety. It's the space where ego dies and truth begins to breathe. We fill our lives with sound because we're afraid of what we might hear in the quiet. The ache, the doubt, the weariness, the questions we don't know how to answer. But Jesus wasn't afraid of any of that. He entered silence with open hands and found that God met him there, not with thunder, not with lightning, but with stillness. Remember Elijah on the mountain? There was a great wind, but God wasn't in the wind. There was an earthquake, but God wasn't in the earthquake. There was a fire, but God wasn't in the fire. Then came a gentle whisper. That's where God was, and Jesus knew it. He knew the power of the whisper. He knew the fire didn't last, but the quiet voice could transform. He knew that real direction, real comfort, real strength came not in the chaos, but in the calm. So he practiced silence. He leaned into it. He made time for it. And in doing so, he showed us that the kind of strength that changes the world does not come from being louder. It comes from being rooted, still, unshaken, aligned with something eternal. When we avoid silence, we live at the mercy of everything around us. But when we enter it, truly enter it, we begin to find our center. We begin to hear what we were too distracted to notice before. We begin to receive what striving could never earn. Jesus didn't need to speak to be powerful. He didn't need to be seen to be significant. He didn't need to win every argument to walk in truth. Because his power wasn't performative. It was rooted in his communion with the Father, a communion that was most alive in stillness. And so he withdrew, not because he was tired of people, but because he was full of love. And love must be renewed in quiet places. He didn't disappear to escape. He disappeared to remember who he was, to remember what mattered, to remember the sound of the Father's whisper, which no crowd could replace. This is the strength of silence. It clears away the fog. It teaches us we don't need to fight every battle. It invites us to slow down. Not because the world slows down, but because we no longer let it drag us along at its pace. When Jesus returned from those silent places, he spoke with clarity. He loved with patience. He acted with purpose, because he had first been still. So when your life feels loud, when the world is pulling at you from every direction, when your heart is tired and your mind is racing, maybe what you need is not more answers. Maybe it's not a solution. Maybe it's not even a change of circumstances. Maybe it's silence. Not silence as escape, but silence as strength. The kind that steadies your hands. The kind that clears your mind. The kind that reminds you, you don't have to prove anything to be loved. You don't have to be loud to be powerful. You just have to be still. And listen, there's a moment in the Gospels that slips by almost unnoticed. It doesn't involve a miracle or a confrontation or a dramatic parable. It's quiet, almost too quiet to matter. It says, Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Luke 5:16. Not once, not occasionally, not when he had nothing else to do, often, repeatedly, rhythmically, as if it was part of his very breath. He withdrew to lonely places, not places of comfort or convenience, but places where no one could find him, where there was no crowd, no praise, no performance. And there, in the stillness, he prayed. It was in those moments, far away from the noise, the expectations, the demands, that he remembered who he was. Not in the eyes of the crowd, but in the eyes of the Father. There, in the quiet, he wasn't the miracle worker. He wasn't the teacher. He wasn't the hope of the desperate. He wasn't the man everyone wanted to fix their problems. He was simply the Son, loved, seen, enough. And maybe that's why he withdrew so often, because even Jesus, wrapped in flesh and walking among us, needed to return to the center, to realign his heart, to remember his identity apart from what he did for others. It's easy to get lost in what people expect from you, to become what they need you to be rather than who you truly are. But in the stillness, there's no one to perform for, no roles to play, no titles to carry, just you and God. Jesus shows us that prayer is not a duty, it's a return to love, a return to stillness, a return to being. And in that space, we're invited to follow him, not just to believe in him, but to imitate him, to step away from the noise, to leave the expectations behind, to carve out sacred space where the world cannot reach. Because there is something holy in the quiet, a kind of healing that doesn't come through doing, but through being. When Jesus prayed in those lonely places, it wasn't always with words. Sometimes it was just silence, a still heart, an open spirit, a long exhale into the presence of the Father. He didn't come with a checklist. He didn't recite rehearsed lines. He didn't need to say much at all. He simply came. And in that, he showed us that the goal of prayer isn't to get something from God. It's to be with God, to sit in the sacred hush of being known, even when you say nothing. And that kind of prayer changes you. Not quickly, not loudly, but deeply. It softens your heart. It slows your thoughts. It reminds you that you're not here to earn love. You already have it. When Jesus returned from those lonely places, something was different. He walked with peace. He spoke with authority. He wasn't easily shaken. Because he had been with the Father. Because he had let his soul rest in the one place it was always safe. In stillness, in prayer, in love. And that invitation still stands for us. Even when the world feels too loud, even when the demands never stop, even when you feel like there's no time to rest, that's exactly when you need to go. Not forever, not to escape, but to return to your soul, to return to presence, to return to the truth that who you are in God is not defined by how others see you, but by how he holds you in the silence. Jesus often withdrew, and if he needed it, so do we. We don't need to be stronger. We don't need to push harder. We need to be with the Father, even if all we do is sit and breathe, because that too is prayer. That too is worship. That too is holy. And in that stillness, we are reminded we are loved before we speak, before we act, before we succeed. We are already loved. And that is enough. We don't often talk about what Jesus heard when he was alone. We talk about what he said, his parables, his sermons, his prayers. We talk about what he did, the miracles, the healing. the way he touched lives with a word or a glance. But what about the times he said nothing? What about the nights he spent on a quiet hilltop, the moon overhead, the wind brushing through the trees, and the whole world asleep below him? What did he hear then? Not the clamor of the crowd, not the questions of his disciples, not the accusations of the Pharisees, but something deeper, something older, something eternal. In those moments of stillness, Jesus didn't go to perform. He went to listen. And what he heard wasn't always in the form of words. Sometimes it was simply the nearness of the Father, a presence that didn't need to explain itself, a love that spoke without sound. We often think of prayer as talking to God, but for Jesus, prayer was also a time to receive, to be filled, to hear the whispers beneath the silence, to feel the guidance that comes not through volume, but through intimacy. What did he hear in those quiet hours? Maybe he heard the voice that first said, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Not as a memory, but as a living truth. One that grounded him when everything around him threatened to pull him off course. Maybe he heard the names of the ones he would soon call: Peter, James, John. He didn't choose them for their brilliance. He didn't choose them for their faith. He chose them after long hours of listening, of watching, of waiting for the nudge of the Spirit. Maybe he heard the ache of the world, the cries of the broken, the silent desperation of those who hadn't yet met him. Maybe the Father whispered the pain of a widow he would soon comfort, or the hidden shame of a woman he would meet at a well. And maybe he heard nothing at all, not in the way we expect, just stillness, just the sound of his own breath, just the slow unfolding of peace in his chest. And maybe that was the point, because not all hearing is auditory. Sometimes to hear God, you don't need ears, you need space, you need silence, you need stillness wide enough for his presence to settle in. And Jesus made that space again and again. When the pressure mounted, he didn't get louder, he got quieter. When the path ahead grew difficult, he didn't seek opinions, he sought presence. When his heart was burdened, knowing what was coming, the cross, the betrayal, the weight of it all, he didn't harden. He listened more closely. This wasn't passive. It wasn't avoidance. It was discipline. The discipline of listening without needing to fix, of receiving without needing to achieve, of simply being still enough to let God speak however he chose, even if he chose silence. Jesus wasn't trying to get something. He was trying to stay close, to stay in tune, to stay in step with the Father's will, even when it didn't make sense, even when it led through pain. That's the kind of hearing we rarely practice, because it costs us time, comfort, and control. But Jesus shows us that it's possible. Not only possible, necessary. Because strength that isn't rooted in stillness will collapse under pressure, and clarity that isn't born in quiet will be drowned out by noise. So he withdrew, again and again, not just to pray, but to listen beneath the surface, to listen to the heart of the Father, to listen to the ache of the world, to listen to the voice that reminded him he wasn't alone, and neither are we. Even now, in our own quiet places, when we stop talking, when we stop striving, that same presence waits to meet us. That same whisper speaks, if we are still enough to hear it. Not with grand declarations, not with lightning or fire, but with the softest voice you'll ever hear. The one that says, "You are loved. You are mine." You don't have to carry this alone. Jesus knew that voice well, and he returned to it often. So maybe the question isn't, what should I say in prayer? Maybe the question is, what have I been too loud to hear? And when you finally make space to listen, you might just hear what Jesus heard in the silence. That you are enough. That you are seen. That you are held. There's a beautiful moment in Scripture. So simple, it's easy to miss. After the disciples had been working, traveling, ministering, healing, they returned to Jesus, exhausted. They told him everything they had done. And instead of praising their productivity or urging them to do more, Jesus looked at them with compassion and said, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." Mark 6:31. That invitation, quiet, unforced, deeply kind, may be one of the most overlooked teachings of Jesus. Come with me, not go rest, not take a break and I'll meet you later, not you've earned some time off, but come with me, by yourselves, to a quiet place. In that one sentence, Jesus offers the rhythm of the kingdom of God. Work, rest, give, return, pour out, be filled, move forward, come away, and most importantly, do it with Him. Because rest is not just physical, it's spiritual, it's relational, it's about more than sleep or stopping. It's about returning to the presence that makes rest possible in the first place. Jesus wasn't just giving them a break. He was giving them Himself. He saw their weariness. He heard the fatigue in their voices, the subtle weight in their steps. He knew the difference between activity and fruitfulness, between motion and meaning. And so He called them away, not to a vacation, not to a distraction, but to stillness with Him. How many of us ignore that invitation? How often do we keep pushing, proving, performing, because we believe rest has to be earned? But Jesus didn't wait until everything was finished to call them aside. The needs were still there. The crowds were still gathering. The world was still broken. And still, He said, "Come away." Because the world will always be loud. The needs will always be endless. And if we wait for the right moment to rest, it will never come. But Jesus creates the moment. He gives permission. He offers an exit from the noise, not as an escape, but as an act of love. Not so we can avoid the mission, but so we can return to it full. He didn't ask the disciples to fix everything. He asked them to walk with Him, to sit with Him, to be human in His presence, because He knows what we so often forget, that rest is part of faith. To rest is to say, I trust you to carry what I can't. To rest is to remember, it's not all up to me. To rest is to confess, I am limited, and that's okay. Jesus rested. Jesus withdrew. Jesus invited others into that rest, and He still does. He invites you. Right now, exactly as you are. Not when your to-do list is done. Not when your mind is calm. Not when you finally feel holy. Now. In your exhaustion. In your distraction. In your restlessness. Come with me. Not to perform. Not to be perfect. Just to be. He doesn't need you to impress Him. He just wants to sit with you in the quiet. He wants to be your rest, not just offer you rest. Because true rest isn't found in a break from life. It's found in nearness to Him. And in that nearness, something changes. The weight lifts. Not because the problems are gone, but because you're no longer carrying them alone. The noise fades, not because the world is quieter, but because you've finally stepped away from it. In the quiet place, with Jesus, your soul can breathe again. So let Him lead you there, even now, even in this moment. Close your eyes, slow your breath, let the noise fall away, and hear Him say it once more, just as gently as before, come with me, by yourself, to a quiet place, and get some rest. And maybe that's where everything truly begins again.